What was supposed to be a respectful conversation on contemporary politics, race, and the cultural divide between Hollywood and Middle America took an unexpectedly volatile turn when legendary actor Denzel Washington appeared on Bill Maher's HBO show, expecting an honest but civil exchange, and instead found himself face to face with a host who, despite his reputation for progressive views, seemed determined to challenge, corner, and ultimately condescend under the guise of provoking discussion. And what began with light laughter and polite disagreement quickly morphed into a tense ideological standoff that exposed deeper fractures not just between two public figures, but within the broader American cultural discourse itself, especially around how black thought leaders are often expected to perform agreeability for white liberal audiences. At first, Denzel's posture was composed, his answers thoughtful, his tone respectful, choosing his words with the kind of care and depth that had long characterized his public presence. But as Maher shifted gears from questions about Washington's career and philanthropy to jabs at Hollywood elitism, black victimhood narratives, and an apparent discomfort with what he called racial overcorrection, the tone became noticeably hostile, with Maher deploying rhetorical traps disguised as jokes and grinning through assertions like, "Don't you think maybe the pendulum's swung too far now, Denzel?" Which might have been waved off as poor satire had it not been paired with a smug undertone and repeated interruptions that made it clear Maher wasn't seeking Denzel's insight, he was trying to prove a point, and use Denzel's prestige to do it. The audience, usually quick to cheer Maher's wit, grew noticeably quieter as Denzel's expression changed, his gaze sharpening, his silence speaking volumes, and then finally, with the weight of decades of experience and grace under pressure, Denzel responded, not with anger or theatrics, but with piercing calm. "Bill, the problem isn't the pendulum. The problem is who's afraid of it swinging back toward justice." And with that one sentence, the tension in the room exploded into something far more electric than entertainment, because in calling out Maher's dog whistle framing, Denzel had exposed the subtle elitism masked as edginess that had come to define Maher's late career brand. What followed was a rapid unraveling. Maher, caught off guard by the directness, attempted to reframe, suggesting he was merely playing devil's advocate, to which Denzel replied, "Too many devils in power already, Bill. We don't need you auditioning," a line that prompted an audible gasp and then thunderous applause from segments of the audience, including those who had seemed unsure earlier which way the conversation would swing. And while Maher tried to steer the discussion back toward safer ground by invoking his friendship with black celebrities and past support for civil rights causes, Denzel refused to let the pivot happen without accountability, calmly pointing out that support for black lives isn't something to be weaponized as a shield during uncomfortable conversations, and that proximity to blackness doesn't absolve one from critique. Maher, visibly rattled, leaned harder into sarcasm and shifted blame to woke culture, prompting Denzel to ask plainly, "Why does accountability scare you so much?" A question that echoed in the studio air like a challenge not just to Maher but to the broader liberal comfort zone that often praises black voices as long as they don't challenge the status quo too directly. At this point, Maher, cornered in his own studio, lashed out, not with any real substance, but with deflection, muttering, "I thought you were smarter than that, Denzel," to which the actor calmly stood, removed his microphone, looked Maher square in the eye and said, "And I thought you were more honest than this," before walking off the set to stunned silence and a slow building applause that turned into a standing ovation once the shock wore off, as if the audience realized they had just witnessed not only a confrontation but a cultural moment, a line in the sand drawn live on air between posturing and principle. The clip of Denzel's exit went viral within hours, shared across platforms with captions like, "Denzel drops truth on Maher, no more polite silence," and "The day the mask slipped," drawing millions of views and reigniting debates across media about the role of celebrity in politics, the expectations placed on black public figures to tolerate coded disrespect, and whether liberal media spaces were any more welcoming to dissenting black thought than their conservative counterparts. Pundits on the left tried to downplay the exchange, suggesting it was merely a miscommunication, or two strong personalities clashing, while commentators on the right predictably twisted Denzel's walk-off into a condemnation of wokeness, despite his actual message being diametrically opposed to their narrative. But the truth, unignorable to anyone who actually watched the episode, was that Denzel's frustration stemmed not from ideology but from principle, specifically the principle that truth doesn't require permission from power to be spoken, especially when that power is hiding behind satire. In subsequent interviews, Denzel remained calm, refusing to fan the flames but also refusing to walk back his statements, simply stating, "I went there to have a conversation, not to be used as a soundbite," and in doing so, he further cemented the impression that what had occurred wasn't a meltdown, but a refusal to be manipulated into performance for a host increasingly reliant on controversy to remain relevant. Maher, for his part, issued a half-hearted statement in the next episode of his show, joking that Denzel Washington won't be coming back anytime soon, followed by a wink to the audience, a move that drew awkward laughter and was widely seen as dismissive rather than reflective, further reinforcing the perception that Maher had no real interest in learning from the exchange, only spinning it. Meanwhile, a wave of support flooded in for Denzel from across the entertainment industry. Actors, directors, and musicians voiced their respect not only for what he said but how he said it, especially in a cultural moment where rage often substitutes for righteousness, and where choosing to leave a toxic space instead of escalating within it can be the most radical form of protest. Academics and cultural critics began analyzing the exchange in op-eds, podcasts, and lecture halls, noting how Denzel's refusal to play along with Maher's performative provocations represented a form of black dignity in real time, and that his decision to walk away rather than be caricatured was a rejection of both right-wing racism and liberal paternalism, a dual resistance that refused to flatten itself into a binary for the sake of cable ratings. What had begun as an awkward talk show segment had, by the end of the week, become a cultural touchpoint for a broader truth, that intellectual freedom for black thinkers does not require the approval of white audiences, and that disagreement is not disrespect unless the power dynamic insists on obedience. Denzel's calm but firm stance became a teachable moment across communities, used in DAE trainings, quoted in sermons, referenced in classrooms, and turned into memes that combined his cool stare with captions like, "Grace over gaslighting," and "Unbothered." Unapologetic, unmoved. Even younger generations, Gen Z users on TikTok and Instagram, latched onto the incident, not because of Denzel's fame but because of the clarity of his message, and how he modeled integrity in the face of manipulation, reminding people that walking away isn't weakness, it's wisdom, especially when the platform you're walking from is one built on undermining your dignity. In the months that followed, Maher's ratings remained stable, but his credibility among many black viewers and progressives suffered a notable hit, with fewer A-list guests agreeing to appear without preconditions, and a growing awareness that the show's format had ceased to be about ideas and instead become a space for provocation masquerading as inquiry. While Denzel, never one to capitalize on drama, returned to his work with quiet consistency, choosing his next projects carefully and continuing his off-screen work in mentoring programs, scholarships, and community uplift, his presence now carrying not only the gravitas of a two-time Oscar winner, but the unshakable moral weight of a man who, when tested in public, did not yield, did not pander, and did not perform, but instead chose the oldest form of resistance known to anyone who's ever stood in a room built to contain them. He left, with his head high, his voice steady, and his truth intact. In the wake of Denzel Washington's stunning exit from Bill Maher's show, what began as a viral television moment rapidly evolved into a deeper public reckoning with the subtle dynamics of control and resistance that often go undiscussed in elite media spaces, particularly when those spaces pride themselves on being platforms for free speech but bristle when that freedom is exercised by someone unwilling to play into their carefully curated scripts. And what made the moment even more potent was how it refused to fade into the usual cycle of outrage then oblivion. Instead, it persisted, carried not by gossip but by gravitas, not by conflict for conflict's sake but because it exposed an uncomfortable but necessary truth, that so-called liberal spaces often demand compliance in the same way conservative ones do, just with different aesthetics and expectations. In the days following the incident, clips of Denzel's calm dismantling of Maher's false equivalencies were picked apart not only by political pundits but also by psychologists, theologians, and even media literacy scholars, all noting how the conversation laid bare a recurring pattern in American discourse where black public figures are subtly tested, not just on their views, but on their willingness to make those views palatable for predominantly white audiences. And what made Denzel's response so significant was not just what he said but what he refused to do. He didn't raise his voice, didn't match Maher's snark with venom, didn't try to reclaim the segment with counter-theatrics. He simply chose truth over tolerance, walked away with dignity intact, and left Maher fumbling alone in a space designed to flatter his intellect but now echoing with the consequences of unchecked condescension. The backlash against Maher wasn't immediate or explosive. There was no single headline that "canceled" him, but rather a quiet erosion of goodwill from guests and audiences who had already begun to feel that the show had drifted from inquiry toward self-righteousness. And Denzel's exit crystallized those suspicions in real time, creating a ripple effect across Hollywood and the media establishment where producers, publicists, and PR teams began to reconsider whether Maher's platform was worth the risk, not because of overt hostility, but because of the increasingly toxic mix of faux objectivity, forced contrarianism, and a sneering tone that no longer passed for satire. Even within Maher's own staff, there were reports of internal tension, writers questioning the direction of the show, bookers struggling to land guests of Denzel's caliber, and junior producers quietly leaking to journalists that they had warned Maher not to bait the actor, knowing full well that Denzel's reputation was not built on ego, but on principle, and that any attempt to trap him would likely backfire spectacularly. Meanwhile, Denzel himself remained largely silent on the matter, not out of fear, but out of focus, choosing to let the moment speak for itself while returning to his private commitments. Mentoring young actors, visiting schools, meeting with formerly incarcerated youth, and working on a new directorial project that would later be revealed as a historical drama centered on unsung civil rights organizers, a subject that only further reinforced the values that had underpinned his confrontation with Maher. In contrast, Maher seemed almost desperate to reassert control of the narrative, bringing on guests in subsequent episodes who would echo his frustrations about cancel culture, woke overreach, and the intellectual cowardice of modern Hollywood, yet none of them could quite erase the memory of what had occurred. The quiet strength with which Denzel refused to be tokenized, the clarity with which he named the power dynamics at play, and the way the audience, once a reliable source of Maher's validation, had sided not with the host but with the guest who chose self-respect over spectacle. The deeper irony, of course, was that Maher had long branded himself as a fearless voice in American media, someone who said what others wouldn't, and yet when Denzel did exactly that, spoke an uncomfortable truth that didn't flatter the host's worldview, Maher crumbled under the weight of his own branding, revealing that his real issue was never with censorship, but with challenge, especially when it came from someone whose moral authority dwarfed his own. Think pieces poured in, not from celebrity blogs but from sociologists and media critics who noted how the interaction revealed the limitations of performative liberalism, how proximity to diversity often replaces actual equity in white-dominated institutions, and how black excellence, when it refuses to be deferential, is still seen as a threat even in so-called progressive spaces, a critique that stung because it didn't come from the fringes but from the heart of the American cultural apparatus, someone beloved, respected, and undeniably mainstream, which made dismissing his stance far more difficult. Social media, especially Black Twitter, became the staging ground for a wider conversation on the difference between being invited into a space and being welcomed in it, with users pointing out that Denzel's restraint wasn't passivity, but power, the kind of power that comes from knowing you don't need a platform to be heard when your entire life has already become a message of integrity, discipline, and unshakable dignity. Maher's ratings took a modest dip, but the real loss was credibility. Longtime fans began voicing concern that he was no longer curious but combative, more interested in baiting controversy than fostering conversation, and some quietly admitted that watching him try to belittle someone of Denzel's stature felt less like journalism and more like a bitter man clinging to relevance. Even Maher's defenders struggled to explain away his tone, with many defaulting to the tired, free speech defense, ignoring the fact that Denzel had used that very freedom to speak and walk when the space became more about ego than engagement. The most unexpected development came weeks later when other high-profile black guests, journalists, actors, and activists, began declining Maher's invitations, citing Denzel's experience as proof that the show was no longer a safe space for honest dialogue but a stage set for the host's ego, and for the first time in over a decade, Maher found himself without access to the very voices he claimed to champion. Meanwhile, Denzel